Hey everybody, welcome back to another Bible Bite. As I pick these Bible Bites and what I'm going to talk about, I try to pick things that are actually very applicable to me and to my life at this time. And today's is no different. Today's topic is called the warehouse syndrome. You're probably wondering, what does that mean? Well, you're going to have to stick around to find out. So guys, we are here today and we're going to focus on Luke chapter 12, and it's going to be the parable of the rich fool. So this is in Luke chapter 12, and it starts in verse 13 and it goes through 21. So I'm going to read that for us now. It says, "Someone in the crowd said to him, 'Teacher, tell my brother to divide his inheritance with me.' And Jesus replied, he said, 'Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?' Then he said to them, 'Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions.' And he told them this parable. He said, 'The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops.' Then he said, 'This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and I'll build bigger ones. And there I'll store all my grain and all my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, he said, 'You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich towards God.'" So guys, there's three key points that we can take from this parable Jesus gives us about the rich fool. The very first one is found in verse 15, and it is that we need to be on guard. Jesus tells us, he says to watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. So Jesus is telling us that we need to be intentional and we need to be on guard for this, for greed. And he says there's all kinds of greed. So greed does not just always mean money, like I want more money, but this is just more things. It's that discontentment. It's always comparing what we have with what other people have, that it's just never enough. And this is something that's almost built into our DNA. We are born selfish people. In fact, the American dream itself is based upon more things, that we can go from rags to riches, as they say, as if that is the ultimate goal in the end, is that we have the most things. But as believers, we're called to live a different life. And here Jesus tells us that we as believers need to be very careful of this, because we can find ourselves caught up in this trap. And I know for me personally, I continue to battle this. I continue to look at my situation or look at the things that I have and wonder, man, if I did this differently, or if I stayed in my career that I was doing, we'd be doing better off, or we'd have a better house or better things, or be able to even provide better for our family. I mean, that should be a good thing. But here Jesus is telling us that is not what's important. So the very first thing is we need to change our view, and we need to be very intentional about our thoughts. Remember Romans 12:2, Paul tells us, he's like, do not conform to the pattern of the world, right? So he warns us there too. Do not conform to what the world says. He says, but instead be transformed by the renewing of our mind. We have to take our thoughts captive. And we're always having the world and the flesh and the enemy speaking into us all day long. And so if we're not pouring back into God's word, if we're not spending time with God and spending time in fellowship with other believers, building ourselves back up again, we can't expect our mind to change. In a way, it's kind of true. You're product of your environment. So whatever you're surrounding yourself around is what ultimately you're going to start modeling and thinking. And so God's telling us to be very careful. And the way we be watchful is to continue to stay renewed in God's word. The second point that we can take from this is we need to take the focus off ourselves. As I was reading this, God kind of showed me something that I didn't see the first few times I read it. But if you look at verses 16 through 19, as he's talking about the story of this man, and he's describing the man, it's very interesting is you see how many times the guy is focused on himself. And how many times he uses the word I, me, my, they. It's amazing. And so I'm going to just read through those and point each of those out and see how many times in these 3 verses that the guy is referring and looking just to himself. It says this. It says, and he told him the parable, the ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. It says, he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I'll store my grain and my goods, and I'll say to myself, I totally missed one because I think there's 13, but the point is 13 times in these 3 verses that the guy's focused, everything he talks about is focused for himself. And that's what we got to be very careful of, guys, is to not constantly be worried and focused on ourselves. And the truth is, that's our default. Like, left on our own, we easily think about what's best for us. And, as Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 2, verse 3, he says, do nothing. He says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but rather in humility value others above yourself. Because we need to continue to put others' needs before our own. And that's something, again, that you can only do if we're being intentional, if we're being on guard, if we're being, staying in God's word and we're continuing being filled by his Spirit. We cannot do that on our own. We have to have God's help to do that. And so it's so important, guys, that every time we make a decision that we're thinking about, is this something that's just benefits me, or is this something that's really benefiting others and glorifying God? And then thirdly, the last point is that we need to change this viewpoint that we have from being a warehouse to a distribution center. So what do I mean by that? Well, a warehouse is all about storing more and more in. Here in this story, he talks about, man, I want to build a bigger barn. I want to build this huge warehouse so I can put more and more and more in. And so then after that, I can just sit back and relax and take it easy, eat, drink, and be merry. And we all have that same mentality. In fact, we're told that's actually the wise thing to do, that we should continue to just store all of our things up. We have all these retirement plans, and our goal is to make as much as we can in as little time as we can so that we can spend the rest of our life just enjoying that. But guys, if you ever met anybody that's done that, have they really enjoyed that time? Absolutely not, because our joy and our contentment cannot come from those things. Instead, God's calling us to be a distribution center. What does that mean? That means in a distribution center, things are constantly coming in and things are constantly going out. And that's the way we're supposed to live, is just continually being dependent upon the Lord and everything that he's given us. Every good gift, it says, is from above. We got to remember that, things that God blesses us with are not just for ourselves, but that we're to share with others. So guys, you got to take a look at yourselves and say, am I living that kind of life? Is my life bearing fruit for God? Am I storing treasure up for myself? Or am I sharing this with others, knowing that God will give more again? So guys, this is my challenge for each of us, is to be the distribution center and not the warehouse. And I hope, guys, this is encouraging for you guys. And thanks again for viewing these Bible Bites. Please continue to share them and like them. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. And we look forward to seeing you again next time.